Hello everyone, and thank you for joining my talk. I'm Behrem Zitouni. I'm part of the OHB company. My position is propulsion and environment analysis expert, and in the same time I'm leading a team of 5 persons working on chemical propulsion and also electric propulsion analysis and modeling tools development inside the propulsion department. So my talk today is about CFD, DSMC, and ray tracing. So basically, it's a talk explaining and showing how we model rarefied gas plume in an industrial context. So thank you for the organizers, and I'm really sad that I cannot be with you all in South Korea. Maybe next time, and hope that the situation will get better in the next months. That will be really nice to meet you all. But first of all, let me show you the overview of our talk. So today I'm going just to present in the first part the industrial context, so you can grasp actually what are the objectives and the constraints that we need to deal with as modeling engineers in a commercial company. And let's say that the plume analysis is very important for us for the satellite design. I'm going to explain you why and show you the methodology that we put in place. So we have to really find a compromise between having a good representation of rarefied gas dynamics and at the same time very quick and efficient solutions. The second part, which is the main part of this talk, would be about the plume modeling. So this approach will be about the full ray tracing first. I'm going to show you and explain you how we do this modeling, the CFD and DSMC on 2D and 3D coupling parts, and then how we apply this in the projects. And the last point about OpenPlume CP, our project that is free, available for download. I will come back to it later. So in which context the plume impingement is studied at OHB? So as you can see here, the plume analysis is really in the middle of different subsystems that are interacting with this analysis, because the thrusters, when they fire, they're going to interact with different surfaces of the satellite. So the plume will interact, for example, with the attitude and orbital control system by inducing undesired forces and torques. As we have quite high heat flux in the near field, we have some heat fluxes that can be very important to take into account in the thermal design on different components. We can also induce power loss on the solar panels, for example, due to the droplets distribution on the solar cells. And if we have like a payload such as antennas or also optics like a telescope for an exploration mission, then you can have also plume impingement. So as you can see, it's not only modeling the rarefied gas plume completely separated from the rest, but it has quite important impacts on the other part of the subsystem of the satellite. So in this slide you could see, let's say it's divided on 4 parts, which are the capabilities, what we could perform as analysis, the modeling tools existing, and the application of the projects. So the capabilities, so basically the projects, they come to us and they need to know how they accommodate the thruster on the satellite and to minimize its bad effects on the design. So they want to know what is the end of life performance degradation due to the thruster firing, how we can accommodate the satellite and the thrusters in an optimized way, and how is the impact on the IOCS maneuvers. Of course, one of the most important part is to check on the radiators, optics, and payloads, all of these sensitive components, as I showed earlier, the risk assessment in terms of the performance loss. So what we do, basically we do any type of thrusters with our method and tools there. We started quite easy with the cold gas thrusters modeling, and then we moved to monopropellant, bipropellant thrusters. And what we also provide to the teams is the thermal fluxes impact from the thruster plume, the disturbance forces and torques, and the contamination as explained, which is the gases distribution and the droplets. So the modeling tools that we have, so we developed our own approach there, which is called OpenPlume CP, which is a ray tracing approach. and OpenPlume DSMC. So when I said OpenPlume DSMC, it's mainly based on DS2V and DS3V, Professor Bird tools that are still very widely used, at least in our company in OHB. And OpenPlume DSMC, you will see later, we call it the OpenPlume DSMC, as these are like Python scripts that are able to prepare the simulation for the DS2V calculation or DS3V calculation. The ray tracing, on the other hand, I will show it later, is based on the CFD part and extrapolation in the far field. And this both approaches helped us to really model different kinds of impact on the solar panel, on the different components present to the thruster. For example, here we have a print screen from the DS3V program. So in the project, we helped to basically design thruster shield. We optimized MTG, so this is Meteosat third generation thrusters accommodation. Plato is a satellite with a lot of cameras that are going to be in Lagrange point. So you see that it really has concrete application in the project. It's not like a theoretical analysis that we are doing. So to break it down, we basically have what I call classic configurations on the spacecraft impingement, a complex configuration, and the classic configuration, what I say is impact on the far field. Basically, you have a plume, you have a thruster existing there, and the plume is undisturbed and is going to apply forces and torques and also induce thermal fluxes on the solar panel and contamination. So these are like the classic configuration that we have, thrusters on solar panels, for example, and the application is classic telecommunication satellites. What is complex configuration? This is why we need basically DSMC approach, is when you have an impact in the near field or in the backflow. So here you have an example on the near field. You have these two cones who are two thrusters next to this antenna feed, and the component present there is disturbing the flow. So we need to model this differently. So the plume analysis need to be flexible. To sum it up, so if we are too much conservative, then we can block the design for no issues, no possible issues. And if you are too optimistic, then we can neglect some possible flaws. So we have to really be careful about how we model this. And this is why we developed all these methods. So let's come a little bit more in details about the plume modeling. So this is what I call the classic thruster configuration. So you all know, of course, that you have different regimes of the continuum flow, the transition, and the free molecular. So the plume on itself, so it goes through different physical regimes. So you have the continuous and then a transition part and then the free molecular. So what we do is we try to identify each zone with the Knudsen number, but also with the Bird number. I will come back to it later. And basically what we do is we do use a solver, a Navier-Stokes solver in the near field, and then we have like an extrapolation of the far field based on the source flow method. So in this configuration, as I said earlier, the plume is supposed to be, the flow is supposed to be undisturbed, and you see that in this part we have like this CFD part where you have open foam that gets into as inputs the thruster geometry and different boundary conditions like the chamber pressure, combustion pressure, and combustion temperature, etc. And then at the end, we put into account the spacecraft geometry and overall OpenPlume CP extrapolation to the far field. And this I think you are familiar with. You have like these plume then with the nozzle flow, a boundary layer, a continuous part, a rarefied part, and the free molecular part. So what about the more complex situation? So the more complex situation, of course, we cannot use fully CFD or fully ray tracing approach because we have, for example, a component in the near field or we want to see in the back field. So we use a DSMC method by using, of course, the Boltzmann law. And the method here is, again, to combine the CFD approach and the DSMC approach. Why is that? Because typically, of course, we could use a full DSMC approach 3D, but computation time is really not acceptable in an industrial context, so we have to find something optimized and something quick. So this is why we still do the CFD part with OpenFOAM, and we inject then the results from OpenFOAM through a breakdown surface into the DSMC simulation. So to get more into details of each of these methods, so first the full ray tracing approach, and then the coupling of the 2D CFD DSMC 2D and CFD DSMC 3D. So let's see about the full ray tracing approach. How does it work? So the thrusters, as I said, we model that with OpenFOAM. So we have the geometry and boundary conditions that we put in OpenFOAM. And OpenFOAM users are maybe familiar with this, but it's usually a little bit tedious task to really have the simulation stable in OpenFOAM. So what we did is we developed an OpenPlume CFD extra module that controls the inputs of OpenFOAM, prepares everything for the simulation, and then takes out the output from OpenFOAM and then injected in OpenPlume CP. That OpenPlume CP then do the job and make the extrapolation of the far field. So this means that all of this solution, which is based on Python scripts, so we use Python scripts to prepare everything for OpenFOAM, Python scripts to take out the results from OpenFOAM, and then to do the calculation and see this in ParaView. So we used open source codes everywhere to be sure that the users later, we will see later how you can download OpenPlume, is able to really see exactly what he's doing. So this work that we did basically allows you to model whatever type of thruster, could be bipropellant, monopropellant, and to have a quite efficient method there that combining the CFD and the ray tracing approach extrapolating to the far field. So if you go more into detail, so you have like two structures there, the OpenPlume CFD and the OpenPlume CP. So OpenFOAM needs three inputs in this case. He needs the thruster geometry, the gas composition, and the boundary condition, as I said earlier, the pressure and the temperature. So what we do basically also here, we use NASA CA, which is also an open source code that gives us the gas composition and properties. And OpenPlume CFD allows you then, as I said, to prepare the simulation for OpenFOAM. Then the output from OpenFOAM is then extrapolated in the far field with the source flow method, and combines that with the ray tracing analysis of the spacecraft geometry. And at the end, we have the interaction with the surfaces between thermal fluxes, forces and torques, and contamination. Here we will see it later, which is important for us from this output from OpenFOAM to the ray tracing analysis in the far field, is to be able to know the pressures, the temperatures, the density, of course. And this is very important to know, because this will allow us then to calculate the heat fluxes and the other physical impacts that we are interested in later on. So the far field structure of OpenPlume CP looks like this. It's a really close work between OpenPlume CFD and OpenPlume CP, and the core of the OpenPlume CFD is the OpenFOAM, and the core of the OpenPlume CP is the source flow method. So how OpenPlume CFD works? So basically, as we wanted something very quick and stable, boundary condition stable, outer pressure stable, so we used a function in OpenFOAM called mapField utilities. And this mapField utilities basically allow us to map from one geometry and mesh to the other. So what we did is we go from inside the nozzle coarse mesh and then detailed mesh, the second step. So you see this is the coarse part of the inside of the nozzle. This is the detailed part, so we call it coarse mesh and fine mesh of the thruster. And then we go there and prepare the calculations for the coarse far field and fine mesh far field. So this means that first we start from the initial conditions, we fill our thruster there, and then we fill the domain outside the thruster. So OpenPlume CFD then, as I said earlier, is going to prepare all of this for you. This is just a GUI. I just wanted to show an example how it looks like. So we have the boundary conditions, the thermodynamic properties that comes from the CEA code, and we have the different species there, and then you can also create the geometry of your thruster. So the idea here is really to be as efficient as possible when we do the process of the analysis, that we don't need to do this every time, and we are using this very powerful tool called CEA to be able to prepare everything in good conditions for the OpenFOAM CFD simulation. So you see here, for example, how you can create the mesh. So we put different thruster geometry options to be filled. So you can just have a conical nose, or you can have like a geometry with different points, or like some specified points with the text file. The ideas there is really, as we have our suppliers give us the format of the data in different, they give us the data in different formats. So we put the different approaches there to be able quite easily to remodel this in a quick manner in OpenFOAM. So you have to imagine that it's not only about the geometry, but also the mesh is optimized. So we did a lot of work there to be able to quite quickly do this kind of analysis. So at the end you can see, so for example here we have a 4 Newton monopropellant density distribution, 10 Newton bipropellant, the pressure there, and the 5 Newton monopropellant temperature distributions. And this is what is really important for us later on. You see, for example, here we have a really nice shock wave from the 10 Newton thruster that is going to be used, this domain, to extrapolate the results into the far field. So how we extrapolate to the far field. This is, here I just put you 2 slides about really the core of OpenPlume CP calculation, since we are a rarefied gas dynamics conference. So the idea is really to use a breakdown surface and to be able to extrapolate different streamlines into the far field. So basically we have a breakdown surface, and from that we can choose this breakdown surface by using the bird number, and the bird breakdown parameter is explicitly there. And then we see what is the distance between the source point, as you can see in this figure, called R2, and we R1, sorry, and then we extrapolate that to the different streamlines. So the idea there is to be able to, from these 3 values that are known, R1, R2, and ρ1, which is basically the density at this breakdown surface, to be able to calculate the density number 2, which is the unknown. And R1 is the distance there from the source point and the intersection with the breakdown surface, and the R2 is the intersection between the source point and the far field that we are interested in. This is the ray tracing analysis. So basically, first we take the breakdown surface. We have like this length with A and B. So here we are talking 2D. So the 3D, I will show it later, is much more complex to model that we did. But for this 2D approach, for linking OpenFOAM to the ray tracing, we choose something a little bit more simplified based on a physical parameter that makes sense, which is the bird breakdown parameter. So we apply just trigonometrical formulas then to be able to calculate the density in the far field. As you can see, so we have the R1 and R2, and we do what we call the 1 divided by square R rule, which is the extrapolation to the far field with the source flow method. This, as I said, makes the assumption that the flow is undisturbed. It's really important to keep that in mind, because this method has limitations then when it comes to the backflow calculation, or also, as I said earlier, to the near field and the backflow. However, this method is quite efficient because it allows us to calculate the impacts on every surface of the satellite in a very quick manner. And this is the idea of OpenPlume CP. So we have the CFD of the open foam, and then the extrapolation, the far field, as I show. In this talk, I'm not going to talk and present, let's say, the interaction of the surface. This is another type of formulas, which is how the gases interact with the surface. But of course, we do that also on OpenPlume. So you see an example here with a spacecraft calculation. You have a thruster, you have a solar panel, and you have the calculation there in terms of heat fluxes or also density distribution. And this is quite good, as I said, and give us the results quite quickly to discuss with the different projects. So if we go to the 2D coupling, why we needed the 2D coupling, it's basically because this full ray tracing analysis has some limitation, as explained earlier, related to the fact that we don't calculate quite good in the backflow and in the near field if we have the plume which is disturbed. So you see, for example, here I gave you an example where you have a thruster there and you have a surface which is a plane. It's a panel, sorry, and we are interested to know, for example, you see there you have like no impact at all, and this is related to the fact that we have no backflow model. And also you see it in this also configuration where you have, there is basically impact only there and there where the source flow method is applied, and there is no impact at all in the backflow. So we decided then to model a certain part of the DSMC. So we wanted to be able to track the species in the simulation. So we reworked our analysis, our method, sorry, and then we started the continuous regime with a Navier-Stokes solver, but up to a certain distance. And this is, of course, you all know this, there's a lot of publication in this domain about how you couple CFD and 2D DSMC simulation. So we use this condition up to a certain distance. You see it here in red, which should be our inlet for the DSMC simulation. And the key point there is to choose the DSMC inlet surface correctly. So we did some parametric analysis there to see exactly what is the best, let's say, surface there. And we followed also the different recommendation from the publication in this domain. I think it's something like 2/3 of the thruster length or something like that. So we use this key point then to have everything that we need in the DSMC. So basically the temperature, the pressure, the density, and of course the mole fraction at that plane that the CA code provide. And we mixed all that together, and you see that here you have the CFD part in black and the DSMC part in DS2V Professor Bird tool. So of course we need to do some validation of this method. So what we did is we had a look at one of the thruster by propellant, and from existing data of P2 pressure and also the distribution along the axis. So this is the X in meters here and the P2 pressure there, and the distribution along the angles. So we have the red line there is the CFD DSMC coupling. You see that the experiment is this line, and we have the full open foam simulation and another CFD commercial tool, which you see is completely off compared to the height of the peak of the pitot pressure and also the form of the peak. So you see that open foam, for example, is underestimating the peak of the pitot pressure, and it's arriving a little bit later, where the CFD DSMC is showing better results because we are a little bit overestimating, but we are closer to the peak in terms of distance. If you look there at let's say the angles distribution, so the experiment is here, and you see that the full open foam solution is not that bad, but the form of the let's say the pressure peaks there, this two different pressure with the shock wave is much better represented and follows better the approach, but we're still overestimating. And you see that the commercial CFD tool is completely off there by several order of magnitudes, but to keep in mind that we have quite good results in this case. And also, if you can see, we wanted to see how the different molecules are, let's say, are distributed, sorry, in the domain. This is something that is possible with DS2V that allows us to do that. And you can see that we have, in this case, very light molecules that are located in the backflow. And we have some kind of separation angle around 45-50 degrees. And we have the heavy molecules like the CO2 who are located in the center of the plume. So we have discrepancies at larger angles, but this is mainly due to the experiment that have had some bad vacuum conditions. But the idea here is really to see that the CFD and the DSMC coupling is behaving quite good, is able to give us this species distribution. We are able to have better backflow assessment, especially with the H2. And some words about that. So maybe you could think, because the method that I presented earlier with the open plume, with open foam CFD is based on a mixture approach. So we consider the gas being a mixture. In this case, we wanted to take the species separately, and this is due to the contamination issue. Remember, I told you about that the project are interested of the contamination. So basically, you have the gases distribution that are missing with the full mixture approach, and this has helped us a lot, the DS2V tool, to be able to model these approaches and to see where are the molecules are expanding from the rarefied gas. So I arrived to the last part, of my talk, which is about the 3D coupling. So yeah, we talked about it, that basically we should be able to do a full DSMC solution, but we used the Navier-Stokes approach for the nozzle and emitted near field, and we combined that to the DSMC solution. So once we have the 2D and once we have the ray tracing, why we are interested in the 3D. So the 3D, as I showed earlier, the 2D DSMC approach will not allow us to calculate the impact on a component located next to the thruster. So by this we are able to do that, and let me show you the method. We separate the domain in two as usual, so we use an open foam approach for the continuum part and the S3V for the rest of the domain. And we need what we call an inflow surface. So the inflow surface will provide, let's say, the continuum flow parameters as boundary condition for the S3V. And again, as we can see in the next slide, we used a lot of Python scripts to be able to first on the first part here on the right, to be able from the flow files from the OpenFOAM to choose a breakdown surface and to convert it in triangles so the S3V can read it. And at the same time we take the step geometry file that is provided from the satellite and we simplify it in different triangles. And then we have the DS3V configuration files ready. Again, all of this is done with Python. This is what I call Open Plume DSMC, which is again preparing the inputs for DS3V, and to DS3V is able to do the calculations. As you can see here, you have the breakdown parameter number, which is from Professor Bird. And of course, this inflow surface looks completely different from the one we chose earlier. Not completely, sorry, no. It looks more detailed than the ones that we saw earlier. So you see that here it's a much bigger 3D inflow surface with a density distribution at different parts. And we take that and we inject it completely 3D in the simulation where the satellite exists. So to validate again, we did a simulation of on-ground experiment, which is the Trinks experiment from 89, sorry, and the Detler from 2000. So you see that here you have a thruster that is firing and a plate with the different thermocouples that allow us to know what kind of thermal fluxes we have. So the near field comparison showed that this is the DSMC, OHB DSMC, which is based on DS3V, and this is Open Plume that has some troubles, as you can see, in the near field and the backflow, and this is the commercial tool. So we see that here we have really quite good results, and we don't have that much difference compared to the let's say experiment. So in conclusion, just to keep in mind, you have an industrial context, you have to go quick, you have to give results who are backed by simulation approaches. So we give the the project quite satisfactory results by using full ray tracing analysis for classic configurations. The 2D or 3D coupling allowed us to calculate the impacts in the backflow and the near field. And OpenPlume CP DSMC module, just as an information, is not yet released on our website since we need some additional work. But however, the basic version is available for free to be downloaded from openplume.org website. And that was my talk. Thank you everybody for your attention. I will be pleased to take any of your questions and talk to you soon.